In October 2021, an ordinary excavation crew performs a routine trenching task in the remote, rolling farmland of the Falaise region in Normandy. The steel teeth of the backhoe scrape violently against dense, unyielding subterranean concrete. The operator cuts the engine, plunging the French countryside into an eerie, sudden silence. They stop. Buried exactly 14 feet below the topsoil lies an undisturbed, reinforced German field safe, wrapped in decaying tarpaulin. The heavy rusted door is practically welded shut by 77 years of moisture, but the distinctive Nazi eagle stamped into the iron casing triggers the immediate arrival of French heritage authorities. When the specialized military archaeological team arrives, they uncover a much larger subterranean network than initially expected, revealing a perfectly preserved forward intelligence bunker. Inside the main chamber lies a stack of pristine, leather-bound Wehrmacht field journals dated August 1944, and a bizarrely out-of-place American map that suggests an impossible collaboration between opposing forces. Ernst Kessler was a Wehrmacht intelligence captain who was supposed to have perished during the chaotic retreat across the Seine. According to official military records, his entire unit was obliterated by Allied artillery, taking all their classified observations to the grave. But the leather-bound journals tell a completely different story. Kessler had been watching the Americans. In his final entry, dated just hours before his capture, the Prussian-trained officer described watching an American private openly argue with a sergeant over a tactical map. Out loud, pointing aggressively, shaking his head in blatant defiance of rank, and then, the ultimate shock, the sergeant actually changed the plan. Kessler noted that he leaned over to a fellow captive and whispered that these men were not soldiers at all. They were a mob. He was entirely wrong, and that fundamental miscalculation cost the German Empire the entire war. This hidden cache of documents provides a forensic audit of the most misunderstood military culture in history. If you want to see how this story unfolds, hit the like button. How did a military force that Germany considered an undisciplined rabble systematically dismantle a 300-year-old tradition of absolute tactical perfection? Captain Ernst Kessler was exactly 32 years old in the summer of 1944, a man whose entire existence had been forged in the rigid, uncompromising fires of Prussian military tradition. Born into a family of career officers in Dresden, Kessler possessed a razor-sharp analytical mind and a reputation for producing flawless, ruthlessly objective intelligence reports. He was not a fanatic, but rather a methodical technician of war, a man who viewed the battlefield as a massive, perfectly ordered chessboard. He possessed a quiet, almost cold personality, preferring the company of logistics tables and topographical maps over the camaraderie of the officers' mess. Kessler believed entirely in the doctrine of the German war machine, a system built on centuries of aristocratic military science, where orders flowed downward like gravity, absolute and unquestionable. However, the historical situation in the late summer of 1944 was rapidly deteriorating into a catastrophic nightmare for the German forces. Following the massive Allied invasion of Normandy, the supposedly impenetrable Atlantic Wall had been completely shattered. By August, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers found themselves slowly being encircled in the infamous Falaise pocket, a devastating trap closing around them under relentless aerial bombardment. The German military collapse in the West was accelerating at a terrifying pace. Bridges were destroyed, fuel depots were entirely obliterated, and communication lines between command headquarters and frontline units were completely severed. But as Kessler desperately analyzed intercepted radio traffic and debriefed captured Allied soldiers, he noticed early signs that something simply did not add up. The Americans were advancing with a speed and fluidity that defied all established military logic. This was a nation whose army, just 4 years earlier in 1940, ranked as the 17th largest in the entire world. It was a force fundamentally smaller and less equipped than the army of Portugal. How had a civilian population of farmers, factory workers, and shop clerks transformed into a mechanized juggernaut capable of outmaneuvering the most experienced combat veterans in Europe? The answer lay in a fundamental, irreconcilable cultural divide. In August 1934, every single Wehrmacht soldier swore a sacred, personal oath of unconditional obedience directly to Adolf Hitler. This oath forged an iron chain of command that demanded absolute compliance. It was a 300-year-old cage of Prussian discipline that created phenomenal tactical execution but completely paralyzed independent thought. Kessler began to suspect that this very rigidity was not their greatest strength, but their most fatal flaw. He started documenting bizarre American battlefield behaviors, carefully noting instances where low-ranking U.S. troops, completely cut off from their commanders, simply invented new tactics on the spot. However, Kessler was playing a dangerous game, writing sociological observations that indirectly praised the enemy's democratic flexibility over German authoritarianism bordered on treason. He began keeping a secondary secret diary, hiding his true assessments from his superiors. He recognized that the American soldiers' tendency to argue, question, and adapt was not a sign of a mob, but the hallmark of a highly educated, decentralized problem-solving network. He documented whispered rumors of specialized American logistics officers entirely bypassing the military hierarchy to fix supply chain disasters. He was putting together a puzzle that completely invalidated his entire worldview. What they didn't know was that these hidden journals would remain buried in the darkness for nearly 8 decades. The chaotic retreat from the Falaise pocket was a harrowing descent into absolute mechanical and human breakdown. On the morning of August 16, Kessler received highly classified orders to abandon his forward observation post and relocate his intelligence unit to a supposedly secure bunker 12 miles to the east. The official destination was a fortified command post near the village of Chambois, but Kessler had independently mapped a secret route through the dense, forested ravines, hoping to avoid the relentless Allied fighter-bombers that controlled the skies. He packed his 3 heavy leather journals into a waterproof canvas satchel, fully aware that the sociological data contained within them was far more valuable than the tactical maps he was ordered to burn. The journey was immediately fraught with catastrophic obstacles. The temperature hovered around a stifling 85 degrees, and the air was thick with the suffocating smell of burning diesel and cordite. The roads were virtually impassable, clogged with the shattered, smoking wreckage of Panther tanks and abandoned supply trucks. Kessler and his remaining 14 men were forced to abandon their vehicles when the fuel gauge on their primary transport dropped to 0%. They continued on foot, navigating through treacherous, muddy farm fields, while the concussive shockwaves of distant 155 artillery shells rattled their teeth. But the hardship rapidly escalated from a minor logistical problem to a full-blown survival crisis. As they crept through a seemingly empty orchard, a sudden, blinding rainstorm turned the ground into a treacherous mire. They were entirely cut off from radio contact, isolated in a narrowing corridor of death. It was during this terrifying march that Kessler witnessed the American doctrine of adaptability firsthand. Taking cover in a ruined farmhouse, he watched through his binoculars as an American armored column was unexpectedly ambushed by a hidden German anti-tank gun at a distance of merely 200 yards. According to German military doctrine, the American unit should have halted, secured a perimeter, and radioed battalion command for specific artillery support. a process that would take at least 45 minutes. However, the American response was terrifyingly instantaneous and entirely improvised. Without waiting for a single order from a commissioned officer, a 22-year-old American sergeant aggressively redirected 2 Sherman tanks through a civilian brick wall, flanking the German position while infantrymen laid down suppressing fire. The entire engagement was resolved in less than 11 minutes. Kessler documented the smell of pulverized brick and the deafening roar of the Sherman engines, noting that the American non-commissioned officers operated with the authority of German generals. This was a critical turning point that completely changed everything Kessler understood about warfare. He recalled reading recent intelligence reports about General George S. Patton. In early 1943, following the disastrous American defeat at Kasserine Pass, Patton took command of the shattered II Corps. It took Patton exactly 17 days to completely transform a demoralized, defeated unit into an aggressive, lethal fighting force. And he didn't do it with mere motivational speeches. He did it by ruthlessly enforcing basic discipline while simultaneously empowering lower-ranking officers to take immediate, violent initiative. As Kessler's exhausted unit finally reached the outskirts of their destination, they were met with near disaster. The supposedly secure bunker had already been overrun by elements of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division. Trapped, starving, and entirely out of ammunition, Kessler made the hardest decision of his military career. He ordered his men to surrender, but before stepping out with his hands raised, he meticulously buried his heavy satchel, containing the 3 journals deep beneath the floorboards of an adjacent, collapsed concrete shelter. He arrived in American captivity not as a proud conqueror, but as a profoundly shaken observer who had just watched his entire military philosophy crumble into dust. The interrogations began almost immediately after Kessler was transporting to a temporary prisoner of war camp near Cherbourg. American military intelligence officers, fluent in German and ruthlessly efficient, separated Kessler from his men. For 14 consecutive days, they subjected him to intense, grueling questioning, who searched his personal effects. A specialized team of psychological warfare officers specifically looking for Wehrmacht assessments of Allied troop morale. They asked relentlessly about German defensive positions and communication codes, completely unaware that the most valuable intelligence Kessler possessed was already buried 14 feet underground back in Falaise. Kessler played the part of the defeated, cooperative, but strategically useless prisoner perfectly. He provided accurate but outdated tactical data, deliberately steering the interrogators away from his sociological observations. He knew that if the Gestapo or SS hardliners within the POW camp discovered he had written a manifesto essentially praising the American democratic military structure, he would be quietly murdered in his sleep. When the war finally ended in 1945, Kessler was eventually repatriated to a shattered Germany. He carefully constructed a facade of a completely normal post-war life, securing a quiet administrative job at a regional bank in Frankfurt. However, there were American investigators who remained deeply suspicious of Kessler's incredibly sparse intelligence file. Major Thomas Sterling, a former sociology professor turned Army intelligence analyst, noticed glaring inconsistencies in Kessler's capture report. Sterling was highly competent. He recognized that a captain of Kessler's pedigree would never have been captured without a primary observation log. Sterling spent years cross-referencing altered records and hunting for missing pages from the Wehrmacht's regional intelligence archives. He knew Kessler was hiding something profound about the cultural clash between the 2 armies, but the evidence gap was simply too massive to bridge. A time-passing montage of quiet desperation ensued. The 1950s rolled into the 1960s. Decades slipped away and the trails grew completely cold. Kessler married, had 3 children, and took the commuter train to his banking job every single morning at 7:15 a.m. He never spoke of the war, never attended veteran reunions, and never once attempted to return to Normandy to retrieve his buried truth. He watched on television as the world moved on, carrying the heavy psychological burden of a man who understood exactly why his nation had been systematically dismantled by a supposedly inferior force. He retired in 1978, his hair turning white, his sharp Prussian posture softening with age. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1992 at the age of 80. The secret died with him, or so they thought. The modern excavation began in earnest on the morning of November 4, 2021, driven by the chance discovery of the bunker's exterior blast door. A specialized international team of conflict archaeologists descended upon the rural French site, bringing ground-penetrating radar, laser scanners, and delicate masonry tools. They spent 3 grueling weeks carefully pumping out decades of accumulated groundwater and stabilizing the crumbling concrete ceiling. As they breached the primary command room, the air was instantly filled with the damp, metallic scent of oxidized iron and stagnant history. The progressive discoveries unfolded like a carefully constructed Russian nesting doll. The first evidence layer was found inside a rusted filing cabinet, a series of decrypted American radio intercepts from December 1944. These documents detailed the horrific winter siege of Bastogne. German forces had completely surrounded the American 101st Airborne Division and sent a formal, highly structured surrender demand. The American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, issued a one-word reply: nuts. Expert historical analysis of the German marginalia on these intercepts showed a military command completely paralyzed by confusion. The Prussian general who received the reply, Heinrich von Leutwitz, literally could not process the informal, colloquial defiance. It broke his brain. The German command structure required everything to fit into neat, predictable bureaucratic boxes. The American refusal to play by those rigid rules caused temporary operational paralysis. But the excavation team pressed deeper. Layer 2 was uncovered in a secondary dispatch room. Here they found Kessler's meticulously drawn logistical diagrams. Through forensic cryptographic analysis, the team decoded Kessler's notes regarding a major American supply miracle. Kessler had documented the actions of a single, unnamed American officer who completely reorganized a paralyzed army group's supply lines in just 11 days. Historical records cross-referenced by the modern team revealed this officer was essentially a former whiskey salesman. He was a civilian corporate logistics expert who had simply applied commercial liquor distribution systems to military artillery shells. The German military, strictly segregated from civilian commercial practices, could never have generated such a wildly unorthodox solution. However, the third layer of evidence struck even closer to the heart of the mystery. Hidden inside a hollowed-out ventilation shaft were Kessler's translations of captured American internal correspondence. These documents foreshadowed a massive post-war sociological effort known as the Stufer Survey. Samuel Stufer eventually interviewed over 500,000 American soldiers to understand combat psychology. Kessler's early intercepts proved that the German High Command knew the Americans were heavily questioning their own leadership, complaining constantly, and demanding better rations. To the authoritarian German mind, this complaining was definitive proof of a weak, fractured military on the verge of collapse. But container number 4 held something that changed everything. At the very back of the bunker, buried beneath a false concrete floorboard, the team finally extracted Kessler's heavy canvas satchel. Inside, perfectly preserved by the watertight seal, were the 3 leather-bound journals. The ultimate truth was written in Kessler's own immaculate handwriting. He had solved the mystery of the D-Day Panzer reserves. On June 6, 1944, critical German tank divisions sat completely still for crucial hours while the Allies stormed the beaches. Why? Because the absolute authority of the Wehrmacht oath meant nobody dared wake Adolf Hitler to ask for permission to move them. Kessler's final journal entry concluded that the American mob was actually a highly sophisticated, decentralized organism. Because American soldiers were raised in a democracy, they possessed the civic expectation of independent thought. They argued because they were invested in the outcome, not because they were disloyal. The rigid German hierarchy required perfect orders from the top to function. The American army functioned despite terrible orders, because the privates and sergeants simply figured it out on the ground. The historical significance of Ernst Kessler's hidden journals cannot be overstated. For decades, military historians have debated the exact mechanical and strategic reasons for the Allied victory in Europe, often focusing heavily on industrial output, Soviet manpower, and sheer volume of artillery. But Kessler's buried sociological audit reshapes entirely what we thought we knew about the fundamental mechanics of the Second World War. It proves that the conflict was not just a clash of steel and explosives, but a brutal, high-stakes collision of two completely incompatible cultural philosophies. The 300-year-old cage of Prussian military tradition had created an army that was tactically brilliant but strategically brittle. Like a highly complex mechanical watch, if one gear in the German command structure broke, if communications were cut or a general was killed, the entire machine violently ground to a halt. The American military, however, operated more like a biological immune system. When a threat presented itself, the lowest-level cells, the privates, the corporals, the young sergeants, reacted immediately and autonomously without waiting for the brain to send a perfect typed command. The arguing, the pointing, the blatant disrespect for bad plans that Kessler witnessed was the actual mechanism of their victory. This profound revelation serves as a total vindication of dismissed early investigators like Major Thomas Sterling. Sterling had argued in the late 1950s that the Wehrmacht's internal intelligence had recognized the superiority of American democratic flexibility, but his theories were largely marginalized by historians who preferred to focus on tank specifications and battle maps. Kessler's journals provide the concrete, undeniable primary source documentation that Sterling spent his entire life hunting for. It explicitly connects the dots between a nation's civic culture and its performance under the extreme stress of combat. This explains exactly why a whiskey salesman could revolutionize supply chains, and why a general could answer a formal surrender demand with a single word of slang. Furthermore, the discovery of Kessler's bunker has sparked an intense, renewed interest in the wider network of Wehrmacht intelligence gathering. Historians are now actively re-evaluating related cases of lost German sociological assessments, searching for similar buried caches across the former Western Front. There are ongoing, unresolved investigations into whether other German officers attempted to smuggle similar warnings back to high command, only to have their reports suppressed by the fanatical Nazi leadership. The truth is no longer hidden. It is meticulously catalogued and displayed, proving that authoritarian rigidity will ultimately shatter when struck by the chaotic, adaptable force of a free people. Tucked carefully inside the back cover of the final, leather-bound journal, the excavation team discovered two deeply personal objects that humanized the brilliant, conflicted German officer. The first was a crisp, formal photograph of a younger Kessler standing at rigid attention, alongside three stern, heavily decorated Prussian commanders in 1939. The men in the photo looked like statues, devoid of any warmth or flexibility. Clipped directly to this photograph was a small, hastily drawn pencil sketch Kessler had made in 1944. It depicted the two American soldiers he had watched arguing over the map in the dirt. The sketch captured the dynamic tension, the frantic hand gestures, and the living, breathing energy of men actively solving a problem. The contrast between the two images was absolutely staggering. In his final years, Kessler lived a quiet, almost entirely unremarkable life in Frankfurt. His eldest daughter, Clara, who was contacted by researchers following the 2021 excavation, provided a bittersweet glimpse into the man who had buried his greatest revelation.